Rick Sterling is a former aerospace engineer who currently works as an investigative journalist traveling around the world and reporting from on the ground in Syria, Russia, and elsewhere. He is featured frequently on Consortium News, RT, and other outlets. Thanks for joining us, Mr. Sterling.
Very nice to be here.
Now, Trump has ended the secret CIA program for funding moderate rebels. Although we know there are no moderate rebels, so they were essentially funding Al-Qaeda and Daesh. Some are celebrating this decision. Others are not so convinced. They say this could be a head fake. What can you tell us about this purported end to the program?
Well, it's positive news in one sense, but we'll need to see if it's followed through with and actually implemented and enforced. For many years now, there's been a lot of deception in the U.S. Involvement in the Syria conflict. The CIA was involved right from the get-go in 2011 with shipping armaments stolen from the Libyan arsenal after the fall of Gaddafi to supply quote-unquote moderate rebels, basically extremists of one sort or another, in Syria. And it was only in 2013 that they did a public acknowledgement, and it was public news that they were doing that. But of course, it had been going on for a couple of years. So we'll have to wait and see whether this is actually enforced or not.
And do you see it plausible? Some analysts stipulate that the rebel funding has ceased only for certain groups. Meanwhile, it may continue for others.
Well, absolutely. Certainly, the U.S. is pouring a lot of weaponry and support into the so-called Syrian Democratic Forces. That is the predominantly Kurdish group that's fighting in eastern Syria. And actually, there's just breaking news today that the SDF did the first attack on the Syrian army and killed 4 Syrian soldiers. So we're going to have to see whether that's whether that's an aberration or whether that's the start of new conflict between the SDF and the Syrian Arab army.
And what about the 10 illegal U.S. military bases in Syria? Trump says troops are supposed to be withdrawing. Meanwhile, I believe yesterday or today, Russia just signed a deal to maintain its Syrian air base for another 50 years.
Right. Well, the U.S. The Pentagon was very angry that just a few days ago, when Turkey revealed the locations and the existence of the 10 U.S. airstrips and military bases in eastern Syria. These are obviously illegal. Imagine if another country was to come up and set up a military operation inside the U.S. So it's kind of a holding situation there, where the Syrian government and allies are fighting their first priority is to defeat the terrorists who are threatening the major urban areas and to steadily remove the territory that's controlled by different terrorist factions, whether it's ISIS or Nusra or under their new name, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. But down the road, there's a major contention whether the Syrian government and its allies is going to allow the continuation of the U.S. and their puppet forces in eastern Syria.
And you mentioned Turkey. What about Turkey? We tend to think that either Turkey is in the NATO-U.S. camp or it's in the Russia camp, but it seems to be playing both sides for its own agenda. What are your thoughts there?
Well, I think you're exactly right that they're playing both sides. And they've manipulated the situation for years now. They've manipulated the refugee crisis. In fact, they significantly created the refugee crisis when they basically opened up their borders and effectively invited refugees who had fled Syria to take to the waterway, the short water passageway to the Greek islands, and they were not supposed to do that, and they did that as an action against Europe when they were in heavy contention with especially Germany. So the the situation, the whole Syrian conflict, at one level, it's really crystal clear. This is actually not a civil war. It's a war on Syria by a whole host of countries, some of the richest and most powerful countries in the world, whether it's Saudi Arabia and Qatar or Turkey and NATO, the US, Canada, Australia, France. They've all been heavily involved supplying, arming, training what are, effectively terrorists of one sort or another. But at another level, the situation is complicated because you've got a whole nest of different countries and organizations which have sometimes collateral, sometimes contradictory goals. So you see that in the contention between Turkey and the U.S., for example, where the U.S. wants to use the Syrian Kurds to basically down the road. Their long-term goal, I believe, is to bite off a chunk of Syria and merge that with the Kurdish region of Iraq. That's fiercely opposed by the Turkish government, the Erdogan Turkish government, which is extremely hostile to all the Kurdish forces, be they in Turkey or in Syria.
So if we go back to your initial statement, you'd say it's too early to tell, really, if Trump is, quote, saving Syria or not.
Well, he's certainly not saving Syria. Is he? The best we can hope for is that he's doing what he campaigned on doing, which was stopping U.S. regime change foreign policy and cooperating with Russia insofar as they were they're both supposedly attacking ISIS, and stepping away from the policy of trying to overthrow the sovereign state of Syria. So if they're, to the extent that that Trump is doing that, that's a positive thing, and it's something that he campaigned on.
And turning to Russia, Trump, as you say, has said one of the goals of ending this program, the administration has mentioned the CIA funding program, was to help restore relations with Russia. Do you see that as for real again? Because, the deep state is always there behind the curtain. And, could this be another head fake as well? Because Washington keeps saying they're going to do something and then they do another thing.
Well, the one thing about Washington is from the get-go, they've been nearly hysterical against Trump and against the potential, quote-unquote, loss of U.S. leadership of the free world. And this is what the U.S. foreign policy establishment is very much against, and they're very consistent in that. So that the one time that the U.S. media, mainstream media, and the foreign policy establishment cheered on Trump was when he violated international law and launched the attacks on the Syrian air base, killing over a dozen people, including 9 civilians. That's the one time the foreign policy establishment cheered Trump. That's the one time John McCain said everything was looking good. And McCain said, well, this isn't just a one-off. This is a marker in the road where Trump is coming on to their foreign policy objectives. So I think we're going to have to see how it plays out right now. I was just listening to Robert S. Ford, who is the most recent U.S. ambassador to Syria, heavily involved in supporting the opposition in Syria. And his own background is he was the assistant in Baghdad to John Negroponte, Negroponte being of infamy for organizing the Contras and coordinating with the death squads in El Salvador. In any event, there is a track from Nicaragua and El Salvador through Iraq and the sectarian violence that broke out there, and then on to Syria, and it runs from Negroponte through Robert S. Ford. But Ford is opining that that Trump's move today is a recognition of reality, but then he goes on to talk about the objective of the U.S. dividing Russia from Iran. And I think I think we may see more signs of that down the road, that the real target may be Iran down the road.
And I'm guessing the spat between the GCC countries and Qatar had something to do with that.
Yes.
What about the renewed Russian sanctions that just were passed recently? The EU is apparently furious with the sanctions and seems to be kicking back, or at least mouthing back. And Moscow seems to visibly be getting agitated with these types of provocations and continued sanctions. What are your thoughts on the sanctions?
Well, I think I think the U.S. The dysfunctionality of the U.S. is becoming more and more blatant. In that, I think the sanctions may turn out to backfire on the U.S. and may end up increasing the tension and the division, the separation between Europe and the U.S. and basically down the road making Russia stronger, not weaker. So we'll have to see how it develops. But Russia has not been hurt very badly by the sanctions that were imposed after 2014. And we'll have to see how this plays out now. But a lot of this is for show. It's a lot of grandstanding in the Senate and in Congress. And you basically have some politicians over there who have a very limited knowledge of diplomacy, of international relations, and what the consequences of what some of their actions are going to actually be.
It is a lot of show. Now they're telling us we can't go to North Korea, U.S. citizens. So I was actually planning on doing going as a tourist.
Yes.
A few days ago, a group of high-level retired intelligence officials released a private analysis of the U.S. election hacking data and the evidence on Consortium News, for which you write. And the facts seem to show that it was an inside job, most probably tied to a Democratic Party operative to deflect attention away from the Clinton machine's wrongdoings. It seems the evidence is pretty powerful and should end the Russiagate debate already. What are your thoughts on that article that just came out and that analysis?
Well, I was really interested to see it because it's consistent with what the veteran intelligence professionals for sanity have been saying since the story first broke over a year ago, when they said, and this is following on the statement from Julian Assange of WikiLeaks, which was the publisher of the leaked emails, that the emails did not come from Russia or another state, a state actor. So early on, the veteran intelligence professionals for sanity, and in the lead in their analysis was a former technical director of the NSA. So if anybody would know, that person would be one of the most, well informed about what is possible and what is not. And they said right from the get-go, this was not a hack, that is something that was done over the internet. It was a leak. That is something that was done typically by sticking a thumb drive into a computer and transferring the files onto the flash drive, and which basically leaves no trace on the internet. The NSA basically records, copies virtually every packet that flows on the internet wherever it is in North America. So if it had been done over the internet, they would have a way to find that and determine where it was going and where it was coming from. The fact that they never did that is significant. The fact that the NSA was when the intelligence community issued their so-called assessment on January 6th, the NSA did not sign off as having high confidence in one of the significant findings of that assessment, which I think was significant in itself. But this story that you're referring to a couple of days ago is very good because the analysts from BIPS have determined that what's been deemed to be incriminating evidence pointing to Russia. They say that they're finding evidence that was put there intentionally. So and of course, WikiLeaks some months ago released on the so-called Vault 7 release showed that the CIA had been working on this exact thing, being able to tamper with computer metadata and basically insert evidence which would be interpreted as incriminating one country or another. In the case of Russia, they would leave some Cyrillic characters laying around. So this is a great, and they're explicitly coming out and saying that the so-called Guccifer 2.0, which was picked up by the people accusing Russia, they're saying that that is very suspicious, and they suspect that Guccifer is basically a hoax that was created by the same people who want to point the finger at Russia.
All right, and any final and concluding thoughts on Trump, Syria, Russia, and the outlook for the near future? It kind of seems like what you've been saying, we are at a type of crossroads, a fork in the road now, and we'll just have to wait and see what happens. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think there's one danger that there's a pretty serious risk of something big happening in the next month or two, actually, and I think some kind of false flag incident, some kind of chemical weapons, so-called attack, or something along those lines. I've been worried for a year or two now that there could be an attempt to assassinate Bashar al-Assad, which would have huge consequences. So we're in a dangerous period because the Syrian government is basically winning the conflict. Just in the last few days, Hezbollah in Lebanon basically forced basically captured Arsal, the town of Arsal, which was a gateway from the Bekaa Valley into Syria that was used by terrorists coming through Tripoli and through Lebanon. The Syrian government is advancing in Raqqa. It's advancing toward Deir ez-Zor. The number of terrorists who are accepting, the number of Syrians who have been paid mercenaries, who were deluded into joining the opposition, who are accepting the government's offer of reconciliation, is increasing. The number of Syrian refugees who are returning home because their former homes have been recovered by the Syrian army and they're free of the terrorists now, that number is increasing. So in many parts of Syria, the trend is very positive. Will the enemies of Syria allow that to continue and basically accept the defeat of the terrorist project to overthrow the Syrian government? That's kind of the key issue. I think all people who want peace and justice around the world have to hope that the conflict ends as soon as possible, that the foreign governments that have supported terrorists in Syria stop doing that, and allow a process to go forward. The Syrian government is much more moderate than most people, than people in the West would ever know. I mean, the Syrian government for years now has had an active reconciliation program where Syrians, not foreigners, not foreign mercenaries and terrorists, but Syrians who were part of the armed opposition are invited to come back into society if they agree to stop the armed opposition. And that's being accepted. Militarily, the Syrian government is advancing in most areas of the country. So in one sense, the prospects are looking good, but because of that, we have to fear that the neoconservatives, the fanatics from Israel, the fanatics from Saudi Arabia, will they accept it, or will they do something desperate to keep the war going, keep the conflict going? So let's just hope that that the process is allowed to unfold, and that Syria can once again be peace. They're at the end of August. They're restarting the Damascus International Fair. That's just another sign that the situation's becoming more normal there. More areas are have been liberated from the terrorists. Syrians are returning home from Turkey, from Lebanon, and even from Europe. So that's what we want to see happen and continue.
Let's hope cooler heads prevail. And
Yes.
Where can people best follow your work? I know you're on Twitter, and I'll share that link. You also write for Consortium News, Dissident Voice, anywhere else?
Yes, my articles are published now in the UK at True Publica, and frequently at London Progressive Journal, and the Duran is a publication that's distributed online through Europe. My writing's published there as well. But within the U.S., American Herald Tribune, Consortium News is especially good, and I especially promote and support Consortium News, although, of course, there's lots of good publications. But Consortium is very consistent, typically just has a few articles a day, very high quality, and I recommend your viewers check out Consortium News.
All right. Thanks for your time.
Okay. Thanks. Thank you, Hervoye.